I was hired for the night shift, a task that seemed simple enough. Colleen, Martha's daughter, was frantic. Her mother, a 65-year-old woman wrestling with the relentless grip of dementia, needed someone to keep watch while Colleen caught some much-needed rest. The house itself was a crumbling relic of better days, a gray monstrosity crouching under the cold, indifferent moon. Martha's behavior that night was anything but ordinary. At first, it was the small things: a jarring yell that sliced through the silence, the inexplicable sound of the oven door being slammed shut over and over again, its metal clanging like the arrival of some malevolent force. I found her standing in the darkened kitchen, her frail body silhouetted against the dim light, her face obscured by the shadows. It was unsettling, but nothing prepared me for the true horror that awaited. Around midnight, I awoke to the oppressive stillness of the house. My room, dimly lit by a flickering nightlight, seemed to stretch in eerie silence. It was then that I noticed Martha, her figure ominously still, standing in the closet. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to make sense of the scene before me. In her trembling hands, she held a large kitchen knife, its blade catching the dim light and casting a sinister glint. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice barely a whisper, but heavy with an unfathomable dread. The question wasn't directed at me, it was a confusion born of the void that had swallowed her mind. Her eyes, clouded by an uncomprehending fog, seemed to pierce right through me. Every instinct screamed at me to run. I did what I could to steady my trembling hands, easing myself backward out of the room, praying that my retreat would go unnoticed. The knife's cold steel gleamed menacingly, and Martha's distorted face, framed by the closet's dark maw, became a grotesque mask of fear and loss. I fled from the house, my breath ragged in the frigid night air. My mind raced as I reached for the phone. I called Colleen instead of the police, following her explicit instructions. When she arrived, she was skeptical, brushing off my frantic account as just another night of her mother's erratic behavior. That was until she saw the knife, still slick with a shimmer of moonlight. The finality of the scene, a kitchen knife, left like a grim trophy, settled like a stone in my stomach. I never returned to that house. The night had been a ghastly encounter with the fragility of the human mind, and Martha's last stand in that closet had etched itself into my memory with an indelible mark. The house loomed in my dreams, a dark silhouette against a backdrop of relentless, haunted shadows. The first job I ever got with the plumbing company was supposed to be routine, just a leaky pipe in an old house. But nothing about that place was routine. The house was a relic from a forgotten era, sagging under the weight of its own decay. It was like someone had turned off the world outside, and everything inside was slowly dying. No furniture, no sign of life, just a shell that echoed with emptiness. When I rang the doorbell, it creaked open as if it had been waiting for me, like a gaping maw. The homeowner was a man who might have been in his 50s, or maybe his 70s, it was hard to tell. His voice was a high-pitched rasp that grated on the nerves, and his eyes, well, his eyes were the kind that made you want to look away. They followed me with a hunger I couldn't quite place. "Upstairs," he said, pointing with a trembling hand. "The leak is up there." The water was off, which should have been my first red flag. I followed his instructions anyway, climbing the narrow, groaning staircase. The steps creaked under my weight, their protest sounding louder with each step. It was halfway up when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, many footsteps coming from above. Not just one pair, but several. My heart skidded to a stop, my breath catching in my throat. I froze, listening. The footsteps grew louder, almost rhythmic, like they were pacing me, taunting me. A cold sweat broke out across my back. I dropped my tools and bolted down the stairs, my footsteps pounding in a frantic rhythm with the unseen presence above. The front door was still open, and I didn't hesitate to push past it and stumble into the night. I felt eyes on me, though I didn't dare look back. When I got back to the office, I learned that the house was indeed abandoned. The call had come from a voice over IP number, one of those internet phones that masks the caller's location. A trap, it seemed, designed to lure in someone unsuspecting. I reported the incident to the police, but I didn't hang around for their investigation. There was something in that house, something old and malevolent, that I had no intention of meeting again. To this day, whenever I see an old house with a for sale sign, my skin crawls. And every time I hear footsteps in the dark, I remember the house that wasn't quite empty and the voice that still echoes in my nightmares. I was working the late shift at Domino's, scraping together every dollar I could to cover my college books and supplies. It was a job that had me on the road a lot, which wasn't the worst thing. I got to listen to the radio, zone out, and dream about the day I'd finally be free of the grind. That was until that first night, the one I can't shake from my memory. The house we were sent to was one of those places that made you feel uneasy just by looking at it. The kind of place where even the moon seemed to avoid casting its light. It was remote, so far out that the road twisted like a snake in the dark. The paint was peeling off the walls like dead skin, and the windows were either cracked or covered by rotting boards. I was with Tom, our manager, a guy who looked like he had seen his share of nightmares, and Sarah, another trainee, who was already on edge. We pulled up, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and I could tell Sarah was practically vibrating with anxiety. When the door finally creaked open, it was like a scene from a horror film. The man who greeted us was old, his skin sagging like the overcooked spaghetti my mom used to make. He moved slowly, painfully, as if each step was a struggle against an invisible weight. He gave us this weak smile that sent chills down my spine. "Sorry for the delay," he rasped. "I've been having a hard time moving around." We handed him the pizzas and tried to ignore the sinking feeling in our guts. It only got worse when we heard footsteps, multiple sets coming from upstairs and below, as if a whole parade of people were marching around the house. I exchanged a worried glance with Tom and Sarah, our unease growing like a heavy fog. Tom decided to investigate, his curiosity outweighing his common sense. I followed a lump forming in my throat. We crept through the house, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The place seemed utterly deserted, except for a few tattered blankets scattered around. It was when Tom pushed open a door to the basement that we found them. The basement was dimly lit by a small campfire, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A group of men were huddled around it, their faces illuminated by the fire's eerie glow. In the center of their circle was a baby deer, its eyes wide and terrified. The men were laughing, their voices low and unsettling, each laugh blending into a chorus of something primal and wrong. The way they looked at the deer, it wasn't amusement. It was something darker, something I couldn't quite name but felt deep in my bones. Tom's face went pale, and he didn't need to say a word. We bolted for the door, our steps a frantic clamor against the floor. The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our own spiral of fear and confusion. We all quit the next day, no one asking any questions, no one daring to look back. I can't shake the feeling that those men were part of something far worse than a simple cult. I try to tell myself it was just some twisted group with a dark sense of humor, but deep down, I know there was something more sinister at play. And that's why I'll never forget that house or those eyes of the baby deer, trapped in the middle of a hellish bonfire. It was 2017, and I was hauling a load across the Mojave Desert, one of those endless stretches of sand and solitude that make a man question his sanity. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows that danced like ghosts on the cracked asphalt. I was used to the quiet out here, but this was different. I saw it in the distance, a car parked by the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking on and off like some desperate signal for help. An abandoned vehicle in the middle of nowhere is never a good sign. I pulled over, curiosity gnawing at me. The car looked like it had been there for days, maybe weeks. The passenger door was wide open, swaying slightly in the desert breeze, like it was trying to say something, but couldn't quite manage it. The trunk was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and there they were, 3 garbage bags, their black plastic glistening ominously in the dying light. They were locked, somehow secured from the inside. The bags made an unsettling, wet sloshing noise when I touched them. I was just about to call for help when I heard a gunshot, sharp and jarring, like a door slamming shut on a nightmare. My head whipped around, and there he was, a man, tall and ragged, coming toward me with a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes were wild, unhinged. I didn't stick around to find out what he had in mind. I jumped back into my rig, heart pounding like a jackhammer, and took off. It wasn't long before I noticed that the car was tailing me. At first, it was just a speck in my rearview mirror, but it quickly grew into a menacing shape. It followed me relentlessly, like some predatory shadow. My pulse raced as I kept my foot on the gas, praying for the flashing lights of the highway patrol. When the police finally arrived, the car disappeared as if it had evaporated into thin air. They searched the area, but they found nothing: no abandoned vehicle, no bags, no man with a rifle. The desert swallowed it all back up like it was never there. The only thing that remained was the memory of those bags, locked tight, and the vague, unsettling sight of the man digging a hole somewhere out in the desert, the purpose of his excavation hidden from view. I never did find out what was in those bags, but the look in the man's eyes told me it was something that should never see the light of day. Some things are better left buried, especially in a place where the secrets are as deep and dark as the desert itself. It was the kind of night where the road stretched out endlessly, a dark ribbon of asphalt winding through the void. I'd been driving for hours, and fatigue had settled in my bones like a cold weight. The trucker's life, they say, is one of solitude and endless horizons. Tonight, it was just a blur of headlights and weary miles. When I saw the gas station off the side of the road, it was a beacon of false hope. Its neon sign had long since flickered out, leaving only a rusty skeleton of its former self. The old station seemed abandoned, like something forgotten by time, and I pulled in, hoping to stretch my legs and maybe grab a cup of coffee if the place had any. Inside, the dim light cast strange shadows on the walls. The place was a ghost of its former self. The refrigerator had been gutted, the metal shell hanging open like a dead carcass. There was a chill in the air, but not from any cooling unit. This was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you shiver for reasons you can't quite place. I wasn't there long. Just a quick check around, a few minutes to clear my head. When I stepped back outside, the door that I had shut firmly behind me was now ajar. The sudden openness felt like a breach in reality, a silent invitation to something unspeakable. I shut the door again, harder this time, and got back in the truck, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. As I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, I glanced at the rearview mirror. There was a flicker of movement, something shifting in the darkness behind me. I peered closer, my heart starting to race, and saw them, 3 figures huddled in the shadows of the truck's cab. Their faces were hidden, but the shape of their bodies was unmistakable. They were there, crouched low and still, like something out of a nightmare. Panic surged through me, my fingers slipping on the wheel as I swerved to the side of the road. I jumped out of the cab, heart pounding in my chest, and yanked open the door. They were still there, those 3 figures, their eyes reflecting the light like animals' eyes in the dark. I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt, but they didn't move, just stared at me with an unsettling calm. When the police arrived, they took the 3 homeless people into custody. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and when they spoke, their voices were a jumble of incoherence. There was no clear reason for them being there, no explanation for their eerie calm. But they didn't seem to be a threat, just lost souls with no place to go. I watched them being led away, the fog of fear slowly lifting from my mind. But as I climbed back into my truck and resumed my journey, the memory of their eyes lingered. The gas station, now just a distant speck in my rearview mirror, felt like a portal to something dark and unnameable. And though the night continued to stretch before me, that place and the figures I'd seen left a mark on me that I knew would never fade. I was rolling through North Dakota, the night settling in like a heavy shroud. The road stretched out before me, endless and indifferent, a ribbon of asphalt unwinding under the headlights. I was tired, half drunk on the endless monotony of driving when I saw a mess of children's clothing strewn across the highway like some kind of macabre confetti. At first I thought it was a prank or a fluke, but then I heard them faint, eerie cries, like a distant radio broadcast fading in and out. Childish screams. Not just any screams, but the kind that crawls into your bones and makes you question if you're truly alone in the dark. They were coming from the woods that flanked the road, those trees standing tall and silent, as if hiding secrets in their shadows. I pulled over, my tires crunching over the scattered clothes. The screams grew louder, more frantic. I thought I was losing my mind, that maybe the road had driven me to madness. But then I saw a speaker hidden among the underbrush, pumping out those wretched, false cries. My pulse quickened. I started to turn back when I saw them, figures emerging from the wood, shapes in dark clothing, faces obscured. They were moving towards me, their intentions as clear as the screams that now seemed to echo inside my skull. Panic surged through me like ice water. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I hit the gas, tires screeching as I roared down the highway. But as I sped away, I felt a heavy thud and a sharp crack. Something had hit the side of my truck, and a spiderweb of cracks spread across my window like a grotesque spider's web. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to look back. The rest of the drive was a blur of adrenaline and fear. I kept seeing those figures in the corner of my eye, imagining them lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. I was left with a gut-churning uncertainty, my mind replaying the scene over and over, trying to piece together the meaning behind those unsettling screams and the faces that never quite came into focus. And though I tried to shake it off, the image of those children's clothes scattered on the road haunted me. I couldn't tell if it was a twisted game or something far darker, but one thing was certain: whatever was out there in the North Dakota night had left me with a fear that no amount of miles could ever outrun. Lucas and I were on our usual midnight spree, splashing color onto the old train cars that lined the forgotten tracks just outside of town. The moon hung low, casting an eerie silver sheen on everything, and the paint cans rattled as we worked. It was our sanctuary, a place where the world outside couldn't touch us, just the hiss of spray cans and the faint, metallic clank of the trains. We were in the middle of a particularly intricate piece when we heard it, a loud, metallic clang that echoed through the silence. We froze, paint dripping from our fingers. There was something wrong, something in the way the sound had reverberated, like it wasn't just a stray piece of metal. Before we could react, a shot rang out, splitting the night with its sharp crack. The bullet whizzed past my ear, and I felt the sharp sting of panic. Lucas was already moving, dragging me away from the train car, adrenaline fueling our flight. We didn't stop until we were safely out of sight, crouching behind a stack of old crates, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We never found out who had fired at us. We didn't go back to the site. For weeks it was like a bad dream, something that haunted my thoughts but never seemed to happen. I tried to forget it, tried to push it out of my mind. But it was always there, lurking at the edges of my consciousness. Then, one day, curiosity or perhaps madness got the better of me. I decided to go back to the old train yard. Maybe I needed to prove something to myself, maybe I just needed closure. What I found, though, was anything but comforting. The train car was a canvas of red paint, but it wasn't the work of a graffiti artist. It was crude and erratic, as if someone had been in a frenzy. I stepped inside, the smell of bleach hitting me like a physical force. The stench was overpowering, making me gag. And then I saw a wooden chair in the center of the car, its legs bound with thick ropes. The chair was stained, and the ropes were tied in a manner that suggested they weren't for mere decoration. It felt like a trap, a sick invitation. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my own apartment, heart pounding and mind racing. I tried to make sense of what I had seen, but nothing added up. Who would do something like that? And why? I still think about that chair sometimes, about the eerie, empty car covered in red paint. I don't know who was behind it or what message they were trying to send. All I know is that the fear never quite left me, and every time I hear a clanging noise or catch a whiff of bleach, I can't help but shudder. There was always something raw and restless about riding the rails at night. The thrill of the ride, the endless stretch of tracks under a sky smeared with stars, it was a kind of freedom that few ever understood. I was a train hopper, a vagabond by choice, and the open freight cars were my refuge. That night, though, something changed. It was as if the world had shifted and left me behind. I jumped onto an old freight car somewhere outside of Boston. The chill in the air was biting, and the wind howled like a thing possessed. The tunnel was coming up, a dark maw in the distance that promised to swallow everything whole. I'd been in tunnels before, but this one felt different. It was longer and darker, and the shadows seemed to dance with a malevolence that set my teeth on edge. As the train barreled into the darkness, I felt a sense that the air had grown thick and heavy. I was sitting on the edge of the car, trying to get comfortable when it happened. My heart nearly stopped. I felt it cold, clammy hands, fingers grasping, reaching from the darkness. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the inky void of the tunnel and the roar of the wheels against the tracks. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. I scrambled to my feet, my limbs feeling like lead. I could hear the whispers now, faint but unmistakable, as if the tunnel itself was murmuring secrets. I stumbled towards the end of the car, my mind racing. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The hands, they were real. I had to get out of there. The train finally screeched to a halt, and I took my chance, leaping off the moving freight and hitting the ground hard. My legs wobbled, and I could barely keep my footing. The tunnel was still ahead, its mouth gaping like some monstrous predator waiting to claim me. I had to walk through it. No other way back to my car, which was parked on the far side. I started forward, every step echoing louder than the last. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. Shadows flitted at the edge of my vision, too quick to focus on but persistent enough to make my skin crawl. I could hear noises now, scratches, shuffles, the faintest hint of a laugh that twisted my gut into knots. My flashlight flickered, and I could swear I saw silhouettes moving along the walls, their shapes distorted and grotesque. They were getting closer. I quickened my pace, my breath coming out in ragged gasps, my fingers gripping the flashlight as though it were a lifeline. When I finally burst out into the open air, it was like being reborn. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I threw myself into the driver's seat and peeled out of there, my heart pounding in my ears. The tunnel had given me a glimpse into something I wasn't meant to see, a world where shadows had substance and the dark could reach out and touch you. I've never hopped on a train since, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever was in that tunnel, it's still waiting, lurking in the darkness, and I have a feeling that it won't be satisfied until it's had another chance to reach out with those cold, clammy hands. I was alone, as usual, at the Southfield station, an old, decrepit part of the subway system that had long been forgotten by anyone with a sense of self-preservation. It was late, the kind of late where the world is too quiet, and the silence is thick enough to taste. I was just about to finish my rounds when I heard it, a loud, metallic clanging from somewhere deep in the tunnel. It was sharp, jarring, like someone was smashing something with a sledgehammer. Then came the voice. A child's voice, faint and trembling, calling out for help. I froze. The sound was so out of place that it felt like an intruder in the heavy silence of the station. I glanced around, half expecting someone to leap out from behind one of the crumbling columns, but the platform was empty. Just me, the flickering lights, and that goddamn voice. I did what any sensible person would do in that situation. I grabbed a flashlight and a radio and headed toward the tunnel. My boots echoed in the narrow, grimy passageway. The air grew colder with each step, and the clanging grew louder, more insistent. My heart was racing, each beat echoing in my ears, as if the tunnel itself was alive and breathing. Then I saw them. At first it was just a flicker of movement, a shadow darting across the wall. But then it became clearer. A small, shadowy figure, a child, perhaps moving erratically, as if caught between reality and some twisted dream. Next to the child was a darker, more imposing figure, tall and heavy, its form shifting in the darkness. It wasn't something you could put a name to. It was just an impression of menace. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to get out while I still could. I backed away, my breath coming out in ragged gasps, the beam of my flashlight trembling. I bolted back to the platform, my heart hammering against my ribcage. I called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I described what I'd seen. When they arrived, they found nothing but a single child's shoe lying on the tracks, caked in dirt and grime. They combed the area, checking every shadow and nook, but they found no trace of the child, no sign of the ominous figure. The shoe was all they had, and it spoke volumes of a story that seemed to stop at the edge of comprehension. They suggested it might have been a prank or an elaborate hoax, but I knew better. I could still hear that voice, echoing in my head, calling out for help from somewhere just beyond the reach of light. They left without answers, and I was left with the unshakable feeling that something had been waiting for me in that tunnel, something that wasn't done with me yet.